Welcome to Pamoja Podcast, the place where stronger lives are built, faith is strengthened, hearts are encouraged, and Christ-centered homes are shaped through ordinary conversations that become extraordinary encounters with God's truth. I'm your host, Mwamba. Last time, we discovered something that completely changed the way I look at difficult seasons. We discovered that while David was still sitting in the cave, God was already gathering 400 men. While Joseph was still sleeping in prison, God was already disturbing Pharaoh's dreams. While Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were walking toward the furnace, God had already gone before them. And maybe, while you're walking through your own valley today, God is already moving in ways you cannot yet see. That conversation left me with another question, one that honestly stayed in my heart. If God is already moving, why doesn't He simply tell us everything? Have you ever wondered that? I certainly have. Why doesn't God simply tell Joseph, "Don't worry, you'll only be in prison for 2 more years"? Why doesn't He tell David, "Those 400 men are already on their way"? Why doesn't He tell Daniel, "The lions won't touch you"? Why doesn't He tell Abraham exactly when Isaac will be born? Wouldn't that make life so much easier? Wouldn't faith become so much easier? The more I thought about that, the more I realized, perhaps God isn't trying to make faith easier. Perhaps He's trying to make faith deeper. Because if God explained everything, would we still need faith? That question brought me straight to Hebrews chapter 11. And I think, for the first time, I began reading it differently. For years, I thought Hebrews 11 was simply a chapter about great men and women of faith. Now, I think it's something much deeper. It's a chapter about ordinary people who kept trusting God while they didn't understand what He was doing. That changes everything, because suddenly, faith is no longer about seeing the miracle. Faith becomes trusting God before the miracle. Faith is no longer celebrating the answer. Faith becomes continuing to pray before the answer arrives. Faith is no longer standing on the other side of the Red Sea. Faith is taking the first step while the sea is still closed. And then, one sentence came into my spirit, a sentence that has stayed with me ever since. Faith is not understanding the author. Faith is trusting the author while he is still writing. The more I thought about that, the more I realized that's exactly what every person in Hebrews 11 was doing. None of them had the complete story. None of them could see the last chapter. None of them knew how everything would unfold. They simply trusted the one holding the pen. And maybe that's where you and I are today. Not at the end of the story, not even close. We're somewhere in the middle chapters, the chapters where questions are still louder than answers, where promises seem bigger than circumstances, where prayers continue even when heaven appears silent. And perhaps that is exactly where faith does its greatest work. There is something I've noticed about almost every servant of God. None of them had the privilege of reading the last chapter while they were living the middle one. Joseph didn't know prison would become the pathway to the palace. David didn't know the cave would become the birthplace of a kingdom. Abraham didn't know how God would fulfill His promise. Paul didn't know his prison letters would one day become part of the New Testament. They all had something in common. They knew God, but they did not know the entire plan. And maybe that's exactly how God intended it. Because if they had known everything, it wouldn't have required faith. Faith lives where explanations stop. Faith begins where certainty ends. Faith continues walking, even when understanding cannot. And I wonder if that's exactly why some of us are struggling. Not because we lack God's promises, but because we want explanations when God is inviting us to trust. And maybe that's exactly where faith does its greatest work. Not after the miracle, before it. Not after the answer, before it. Not after understanding, before understanding ever arrives. I think that's why Hebrews chapter 11 has become one of my favorite chapters in the Bible. Because if you remove the miracles for just a moment, what remains? People, ordinary men and women, living one ordinary day at a time, making one decision of obedience after another, without knowing how their stories would end. Sometimes we read Hebrews 11 as though those men and women knew they would become heroes of the faith. They didn't. Abraham had no idea millions of people would one day call him the father of faith. Joseph never imagined that one day children would learn his story in Sunday school around the world. David never thought the songs he was writing in lonely caves would become worship for generations. Paul never imagined that letters written from prison would become part of the New Testament. They were simply living, trusting, obeying, one day at a time. And maybe that's exactly what faith looks like, not seeing the entire staircase, but taking the next step because you trust the one who asked you to move. I think sometimes we make faith look much more complicated than it really is. We imagine faith as something extraordinary, something reserved for spiritual giants. But when I read Hebrews 11, I don't see superheroes. I see people who simply decided, I'm going to trust God today. That's all Abraham could do. That's all Sarah could do. That's all Moses could do. That's all Daniel could do. That's all Paul could do. And maybe that's all God is asking from us today. Not to understand the next 10 years, simply to trust him today. Because the truth is, God rarely explains himself completely. Have you noticed that? He gives Abraham a promise, but not a calendar. He gives Joseph dreams, but not an explanation of the prison. He anoints David king, but doesn't tell him about the caves. He calls Moses, but doesn't describe 40 years in the wilderness. He calls Jeremiah, but doesn't promise everyone will listen. He calls Paul, but also tells him, I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. God gives enough light to take the next step, but rarely enough to see the entire journey. And maybe that is intentional. Because if God showed me every chapter of my life today, would I still need faith tomorrow? Probably not. I would simply be following information. Faith begins where explanations end. Faith continues when emotions fluctuate. Faith remains when circumstances refuse to change. Faith keeps praying when heaven appears silent. Faith keeps worshiping when the prison doors remain closed. Faith keeps loving when life becomes difficult. Faith keeps obeying when obedience doesn't immediately make sense. And I wonder if that's why God never gave Joseph an explanation. Because Joseph didn't need an explanation. He needed God's presence. David didn't need an explanation. He needed God's presence. Daniel didn't need an explanation. He needed God's presence. Paul didn't need an explanation. He needed God's presence. Do you see something beautiful here? The more I read the Bible, the more I realize God often gives us something better than explanations. He gives us himself. Moses understood that. When God told him, my presence will go with you, Moses didn't ask for a better strategy. He didn't ask for a detailed map. He simply answered, if your presence does not go with us, Do not send us from here. Why? Because Moses had already discovered something. The presence of God is greater than knowing tomorrow, and I think that's where faith reaches maturity, not when I finally receive every answer I've been asking for, but when I can honestly say, Lord, I still have questions. There are still things I don't understand. There are still prayers I'm waiting to see answered, but I know you, and knowing you is enough for me to keep walking. I believe that is the faith Hebrews chapter 11 is talking about. Not faith that understands everything, faith that trusts someone, faith that has discovered. The author is trustworthy, even when the chapter being written doesn't yet make sense. And perhaps that's why none of those men and women quit. Not because they had all the answers, but because they had become convinced that the one writing their story would never stop being faithful. And that thought led me to another question. If faith is trusting the author while he is still writing, what happens when the chapter you're living looks nothing like the promise he gave you? I think that's where Abraham's story begins. Because if there is one man in the Bible who understood what it meant to trust God without having every answer, it was Abraham. Think about it for a moment. God comes to Abraham and makes an incredible promise. I will make you into a great nation. It's a beautiful promise, an extraordinary promise. But there was one problem. Abraham didn't even have a son. Have you ever thought about that? God spoke about a nation while Abraham was still waiting for one child. I don't know about you, but if I had been Abraham, I probably would have had a few questions. Lord, you said a nation. Can we first talk about one son? And maybe that's exactly where faith begins. Faith begins when God's promise seems much bigger than your present reality. Every morning, Abraham woke up. The promise remained, but nothing around him seemed to change. Another day passed. Nothing. Another month. Nothing. Another year. Still nothing. Can you imagine that? The promise hadn't changed. God hadn't changed. But Abraham's circumstances looked exactly the same. I think that's where many believers quietly struggle. We don't struggle because God has never spoken. We struggle because he spoke, and then everything became quiet. We expected immediate movement. God invited us into waiting, and waiting is probably one of the greatest classrooms of faith, because waiting forces us to answer one question. Do I trust God because I already see the miracle, or do I trust him simply because he spoke? Those are two very different kinds of faith. One depends on visible evidence. The other depends on the character of God. And when I read Hebrews chapter 11, I realize God never asked Abraham to believe in the impossible. He asked Abraham to believe in him. That changes everything, because faith is not confidence in circumstances. Faith is confidence in the one who made the promise. The promise may seem impossible, but the promiser remains faithful. Sarah eventually learned the same lesson. At first, she laughed, not because she hated God, because the promise seemed impossible. Humanly speaking, it was impossible. Time had already spoken. Age had already spoken. Biology had already spoken. Everything around her was saying, it cannot happen. But God had already spoken. And when God speaks, his word always has the final authority. That's why I love something the angel asked Sarah. Is anything too hard for the Lord? Notice, God didn't explain how. He simply reminded her who he is. Sometimes, God answers our questions, not by explaining his methods, but by revealing his character. That thought really challenged me because I realized I spend too much time asking, how? While God keeps reminding me, look at who is speaking. Maybe faith has never been about understanding God's methods. Maybe faith has always been about knowing God's heart. And that's exactly what Abraham learned. He never knew every detail. He simply became convinced that the God who made the promise was faithful enough to fulfill it. Then something beautiful happened in my heart. I realized every servant of God eventually reaches this place, a place where they stop depending on explanations and start depending on God's character. Joseph reached that place. David reached that place. Daniel reached that place. Paul reached that place. And perhaps God is inviting us there too. Not to understand everything, but to know Him so deeply that even when life doesn't make sense, our confidence in Him never changes. Because once you know the author, you stop panicking every time you don't understand the chapter. And that made me think about Joseph again, because no one, perhaps more than Joseph, lived through chapters that looked completely opposite to the promise God had given him. Yet somehow, he never stopped believing. God gave Joseph 2 dreams, beautiful dreams, powerful dreams, dreams about purpose, dreams about influence, dreams about leadership. Imagine being Joseph that morning. You're 17 years old. God has just shown you something extraordinary about your future. If someone had asked Joseph, "What do you think happens next?" what do you think he would have answered? Perhaps, "God is about to open doors." Perhaps, "My life is about to become easier." Instead, his brothers hated him. Then they betrayed him. Then they threw him into a pit. Then they sold him as a slave. Then he was falsely accused. Then he was forgotten in prison. Can you imagine how confusing that must have been? Because if I compare the dream to the journey, nothing seems to match. The dream speaks about leadership. The journey speaks about slavery. The dream speaks about honor. The journey speaks about humiliation. The dream speaks about influence. The journey speaks about isolation. Have you ever had a season like that, where what God promised and what you are experiencing seem to be moving in opposite directions? I think many believers quietly lose heart right there. Not because God failed to speak, but because life stopped looking like the promise. And yet, Joseph never stopped being Joseph. Have you ever noticed that? He served faithfully in Potiphar's house. He served faithfully in prison. He interpreted dreams with the same integrity, whether he was wearing a servant's garment or a prisoner's garment. His circumstances kept changing. His character didn't. That really challenged me, because sometimes we postpone faithfulness until the miracle arrives. Joseph remained faithful before the miracle. He remained honest before justice. He remained excellent before promotion. He remained dependent on God before deliverance. And maybe that's what faith really looks like. Faith is not waiting to become faithful when life finally makes sense. Faith is remaining faithful while life makes no sense at all. Then something else caught my attention. Joseph never spent his life trying to force God's promise to happen. He didn't escape the prison. He didn't manipulate Pharaoh. He didn't seek revenge against his brothers. He simply remained faithful where God had placed him. I wonder how often we exhaust ourselves trying to open doors that only God can open. Joseph teaches us something beautiful. Your responsibility is faithfulness. God's responsibility is fulfillment. That takes a tremendous burden off our shoulders, because faith doesn't have to manufacture the miracle. Faith simply continues walking with God until his time arrives. And maybe that's why Joseph could later say to his brothers, "You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good." Notice, he didn't say, "Now I understand everything." He simply recognized that God had been writing another story behind the one everyone else could see. The pit wasn't the end. The slavery wasn't the end. The prison wasn't the end. They were chapters, necessary chapters, chapters Joseph would never have chosen, but chapters God refused to waste. And then it suddenly became personal for me. How many chapters in my own life have I been trying to close while God was still writing them? How many times have I called something a failure that God was calling preparation? How many times have I prayed, "Lord, get me out," while God was quietly saying, "Barry, I'm not finished writing this chapter yet"? That thought changed me, because maybe the goal is not to escape every difficult chapter. Maybe the goal is to remain faithful until the author turns the page. And when I thought about that, my mind immediately went back to David. Because if Joseph teaches us how to trust the promise, David teaches us how to worship while you're still waiting for it. And perhaps that's where we'll begin next time. Because David, Daniel, and Paul all discovered something that Joseph had not yet fully revealed. They discovered that faith doesn't simply keep believing. Faith begins to sing. Faith begins to worship. Faith begins to write. David sang in the cave. Daniel prayed in exile. Paul wrote from prison. None of them knew that what they were doing in those dark moments would one day strengthen generations they would never meet. Think about that for a moment. David thought he was writing songs to God. God was preparing the worship of his people for thousands of years. Daniel thought he was simply remaining faithful in a foreign land. God was revealing his kingdom to generations yet unborn. Paul thought he was encouraging a few churches from a prison cell. God was building the theological foundation of his church. None of them realized that while they were simply trying to remain faithful, God was creating a legacy. And maybe that's one of the greatest lessons of faith. Faith is not only believing that God will fulfill his promise. Faith is continuing to worship, to pray, to write, to obey, even when you have no idea how far your obedience will reach. Perhaps the greatest works God accomplishes through our lives are the ones we will never fully understand while we are living them. And that is exactly where our next conversation begins. Because if faith continues walking, even without explanations, what happens when God turns your cave, your exile, or your prison into a testimony that will outlive you? I cannot wait to explore that with you. Until next time, keep trusting, keep dwelling, keep obeying, because the author is still writing.